I would love to welcome all of you, Michael's family, Michael's colleagues from journalism and academia. By the way, I'm a little starry-eyed at this star-studded journalistic turnout that we have today. And of course, his very dear friends. I'm about to turn this program over to Gordon Stables because we have a beautiful, rich array of speakers. And then, of course, our celebration will continue outside. But I know you're going to hear about all aspects of Michael's life, from his deep commitment to his family, his 20-year plus career of extraordinary reach and impact as a journalist, and of course, his 20 years at USC Annenberg, where he did 3 tours of duty as director of the journalism school. He taught here with deep care and fairly intense rigor. He drove innovation in our curriculum and advanced his own research portfolio with the Alhambra Project. And oh boy, have we been thinking about him recently with that book, What Does Putin Want? And he supported our academic research centers and certainly at all times helping us fulfill Annenberg's mission of being in service to all. On a very personal note, and I shared some of this at Michael's retirement party, he really put the well-being of this community at the heart of all that he did. And one of the ways that I saw that firsthand was he really helped me prepare to lead the journalism school. He spent hours with me on the phone during the summer, which anybody who's worked in academia knows exactly what that means. He took his summertime to spend with me. I still have copious notes that I took. And of course, it included everything from, evolutions in our strategic planning and thinking, changes in curriculum and programs, our high impact work in communities. And then it included the real lowdown, the intel on where all the minefields were to be found. Michael, thank you. And don't worry, I promise I will keep those confidences safe always. So thank you all for being here, for honoring and sharing the extraordinary contributions of Michael Parks, and most importantly, for sharing this afternoon filled with beautiful memories of his life and impact here with us. So thank you, and now I'm going to turn it over to Gordon Stables, the director of our journalism school. Gordon.
Thanks, Willow, and colleagues, honored guests, Parks family, and friends. As the current director of the School of Journalism, I recognize it's a position Michael not only held 3 times, which I can appreciate what that must have meant, but it's a position he embodied. It's my absolute honor to welcome all of you to the celebration of Michael, and I'll do my part to try to help us move through the program. This remarkable gathering of community is a stark reminder to what we've really missed these last few years. There's no armistice days at the tail end of a global pandemic, but that we're finally able to gather together and honor someone who meant so much to everyone in this room and so many beyond. It's a powerful moment. And I think we would all probably know that Michael would have complained about the fuss being made about him. But at the same time, as a student and as a master of history, he would have appreciated the powerful moment that this convening was made possible in his honor. There are so many folks today that made this event possible. First and foremost, the Parks family. Thank you for not only sharing Michael with us, but for allowing us the honor to host this wonderful event today. Thank you to Sasha Annewalt, whose powerful spirit informed every bit of this program. And I, like you, have been watching the pictures. This is an area where we should thank and recognize Alan. Is easy to find, Alan Middlestat with the camera. Alan helped curate all of this and make this remarkable program visible that folks will be able to share. Thanks to our team within Annenberg, Nancy, who worked so closely with Michael, Claudia, Jasmine, Jim, Susan, all of our facilities, events, and communication team to help make each detail of this program a success. And we recognize that it would take a few volumes of scholarship, and we would need a writer and a journalist as powerful as Michael to try to fully capture his remarkable life and legacy. We've invited a selection of family, colleagues, and friends to offer their memories. But because we recognize there are so many folks who want to share, that once we conclude from the scheduled program, we'll adjourn to the patio for refreshments and an open microphone, which will allow anyone to share and really embrace this moment of community. So within that, I will take one of the many lessons that Michael taught me, which was to get off the stage as quickly as possible. And I will welcome that person who worked incredibly closely with Michael, the former dean of the Annenberg School of Journalism and Communication, Jeffrey Cowan, who's now the university professor and dean emeritus. Jeff.
Thanks, Gordon, and you thanked a lot of people. Just let me say that it was Nancy Ruiz and Pat Dean and a few other incredible teammates that made it possible for Michael to do all the stuff that he did during the years that we're talking about today. And Linda, thank you for being such a wonderful wife, mentor, friend, supporter during all of those years, and for letting the school honor Michael Parks today. We were lucky to bring Michael to USC Annenberg in early 2000 as a visiting professor. He managed to visit with us for more than 20 years. After serving as a great international reporter, reporting from over 100 countries, serving as bureau chief in Russia, China, Egypt, Israel, South Africa, he won the Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the apartheid movement. He had been managing editor and then the editor-in-chief of the LA Times at a point hard for anybody there to believe it, when there were something like 1,200 reporters at the LA Times, like 3 or 4 times of a paper today. And it's hard to believe it, but Linda just said he had been in every state but one, and I thought a good little game might be for people to guess which state he hadn't been in. So you can play that game out in the parlor, out in the patio later if you want to. Shortly after Michael joined us as a visiting professor, the director of the journalism school, some of you will remember him, Lauren Giglione, announced that he planned to leave Annenberg to become the dean of the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern. Michael was the obvious choice to succeed him. As Professor Joe Saltzman once explained, when Michael became the director, he treated USC, the academic community, as though it was a foreign country. The Pulitzer Prize-winning foreign correspondent, here I'm quoting Joe, it's always good to quote Joe, arrived and set about to learn the culture, the history, the mores, the language of academia. And since he was a superb reporter, he learned it faster and better than anyone that Joe said he'd ever known at USC. During the decades that followed, Michael became a great friend and mentor to literally hundreds of students and faculty. Maybe you could put an extra 0 at the end of that, maybe thousands. But to be a bit personal, he was a great colleague and partner for me. He was a creative and innovative director, always willing to step into the breach. You heard 3 times as director. Who does that? And to run all kinds of programs and teach all kinds of things. And in an era, remember we're talking 25 years ago, almost a quarter of a century ago, he recognized that technological advances were going to change the profession. So to prepare students for the changing times, he insisted the school develop a multimedia curriculum and that Annenberg create a journal that he called the Online Journalism Review to chart the course of that changing field. 20 years later, the number of those impact and change in technology may seem obvious, and of course they're taking place almost every week, but they weren't so obvious then, and it was highly innovative. In a very different arena, you know how much Michael loved the arts, but you may not know this story. For a number of years, the Pew Charitable Trust had funded a special program in arts journalism for early career professionals. Some were based in Los Angeles at USC, and some were based at Columbia, at the Columbia Journalism School. But in the late 1990s, just before Michael became the director of the school, Pew decided that all the students should be housed at Columbia. Michael was furious. You know, being a picture of him as being furious. He was furious that Pew would treat LA so badly. So in 2002, almost as soon as he became the school's director, we went to the Getty Foundation. The Getty Museum is part of a foundation. They have their own foundation, and argued that LA deserved a foundation-funded arts journalism program to match the astonishing and diverse city. Michael convinced them to provide $500,000 to create a program and then brilliantly found Sasha Anawalt to run that program. Our arts journalism programs helped to lead us to recruit an astonishing faculty who created specialized courses in all kinds of fields. Some of them actually have returned here today to be here. And Michael taught some of those courses himself. Perhaps because his own credentials were as a prize-winning reporter, not as an academic scholar, Michael believed it was important that people who were professional journalists be able to get tenure. So in hard-fought battles with the USC administration, in early 2002, he convinced the provost's office that the promotion and tenure standards for this school should state that, quote, when considering candidates for tenure in journalism, the publication component of the tenure standard may be met through excellence in professional achievement rather than through scholarly research. Michael himself personified that, and so do many of our faculty, who now are faculty, tenured faculty, because of that standard that Michael helped to bring through, and had dramatic consequences for the school. But even more impressive, he was always willing to jump back into service. What crazy person does that? Returning to lead the school for a second, then a third time as the director and to lead graduate programs whenever needed. And as you'll hear in a couple of minutes, among the many things that he did, when news publications were dying, and we know how tragic that is all around the world, Michael and Sandra Bolo-Keach, who are here, had the idea of creating a visionary new product, the Alhambra Source, which you'll hear about in a couple of minutes, that I think would still be alive today had it not been for COVID. Throughout his life, Michael was blessed by a wonderful family, a talented wife, who traveled with him around the world, often working as a librarian in the schools where their kids were, and the kids are here too. Maybe you can describe her as a librarian. And she came back with Los Angeles and the Los Angeles Times, and finally to USC. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Linda Parks.
You'll have to forgive me if I can't remember your names. Michael often worked pretty late and didn't get home till 7 o'clock or so. But I do remember a lot of things about Michael and what you meant to him and what he meant to you. Michael was a wonderful, thoughtful person. Michael was a wonderful, thoughtful journalist. Michael was a wonderful, thoughtful professor. Michael was a wonderful, thoughtful spouse. Michael was a wonderful, thoughtful father and grandfather. Michael was a wonderful and thorough friend. Michael and I met at the University of Windsor, across from Detroit, Michigan, where we were students. Michael was covering a seminar in Canadian-American relations for the Detroit News, and I was working for the director of that seminar. The day we met, I walked into the room for a luncheon, but I couldn't find a place to sit. Michael pulled out a chair for me. I had typed out his name badge and thought with surprise, he's just a kid. He was 19 years old. We wed 13 months later, and we're married 57 years and 2 weeks. We raised 3 wonderful children, Danielle, Christopher, and Matthew. Michael was a foreign correspondent for 25 years, educating the world. Wherever we were posted, Michael built small libraries to educate himself about the events and people he covered. Asking the right questions in his stories could make all the difference in the world. His home office in Pasadena has 35 floor-to-ceiling bookcases, and the home has 16. One of our most memorable assignments was Beirut. It showed what a formidable journalist and father Michael was. In 1975, Beirut was in the middle of a civil war, but Michael felt we could still be safe there. We went in with our 2 children and my being very pregnant. There were bullet holes in the balcony. Food stores closed without notice, and our fridge was filled with hot dogs. During gunfire, Michael said the safest place was in the bathtub. While Michael was in Athens meeting with his editors, we put the mattresses together on the floor and slept in the living room, away from any windows or stray bullets. The next day, we moved across the city to the perfect furnished apartments, which was far from perfect and not very well furnished. But it was on the safe side of the city. A message from martyrs told Michael where we were. Michael decided to get us out of Beirut. People were leaving. The airport was closing quickly. Only first-class tickets were being sold on a flight to London. I was 8.5 months pregnant then, and they refused to allow me on the flight. Michael would not take no for an answer. He leaned into the counter and he grabbed the agent by the collar and demanded their release form. We were on the last flight to London, and Michael stayed behind and returned to the story. 2 weeks later, he walked into the delivery room of the Queen Charlotte Maternity Hospital, raincoat in hand and typewriter. Matt had been comfortably delivered only minutes before. We were both safe and sound. I want to thank the Annenberg School for hosting this memorial to celebrate the life of our friend and colleague. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming to remember Michael. Please remember him well. Michael was a good friend to all of us. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. I don't normally talk with microphones. Usually I have a big class of math students, 200-300 people. But so people often wonder why I call my father Michael. When Danielle and I were very young, he said that Michael was his name and that we should use it. It may be atypical, but that was more comfortable for Michael. Michael was a young father, marrying at 21 years old. Danielle and I arrived soon after. The past 15 months have been difficult. It has been so very comforting to meet friends and colleagues of Michael, people whose lives he touched, people who love and miss Michael. From them, I have realized that Michael raised many people, not just his children. His guidance was patient, sincere, and generous. It was not controlling or prescriptive. At times, I would have preferred for Michael to tell me what to do or not to do, but he wanted me to find my way, to become my own person. It was a bit of an unconventional childhood, living in Singapore, Moscow, Lebanon, London, Windsor, Cairo, Hong Kong, Beijing, Johannesburg, and then off to college in Boston. We had a few strict rules: no disturbing Michael while he's writing, and no leaving our toys scattered about the house. We had a lot of freedom when it came to playing outside. And when I became hyper and was underfoot, which was quite often, Michael would tell me to go play in traffic. I thought that was a normal expression, but apparently not. And I did. As a high school student living in Johannesburg in the mid-'80s, I was riding my bicycle all over town and beyond. I once put 30 rands in my pocket and rode 400 kilometers across the former Transvaal, through the Orange Free State, and into Natal. Along the way, I hitchhiked through the independent homeland of Kwakwa. I didn't have money for a hotel or a campsite, but the police station in Heilbronn, in the Orange Free State, was kind enough to let me spend the night. When I arrived at my destination and called home by payphone, no cell phones, no email, there were no complaints or reprimands. My parents understood my need for adventure and were relieved to learn that I was fine. The 5 a.m. Muslim call to prayer and the clacking of keys on a manual typewriter into the night both transport me back to childhood. To feel at home, I need a few walls of books. I am working on developing a better appreciation for classical music and opera, as they make me feel closer to Michael, who would have classical music playing in almost every room in the house. One of my journalism professors from Indiana University, Claude Cookman, served on an accreditation committee with Michael. Hearing Michael mention having a son at IU, Claude asked him if he knew Chris Parks. And Michael thought that was great. His being associated with me rather than the other way around. Michael and I were quite different, but he was proud of me. The week before Michael died, we were having a nightcap, scotch, of course, talking in the living room. Michael was coming to terms with retirement. He said he'd worked 60 years as a journalist, 20 at USC, 20 at the LA Times, 12 at the Baltimore Sun. Michael said that when he was in Jerusalem, that Warren Christopher, then Secretary of State, would call when he came to town. I can see them meeting at a hotel bar, having a scotch, perhaps the Seven Arches. Warren told Michael he knew the Palestinians had 2 major concerns. And Michael replied, no, they don't. They have 3, and here they are, and would explain. Michael was not bragging. He was just trying to feel he had done enough, that it was okay, that he was allowed to retire, spend quiet nights on the patio with a book, a glass of wine, listening to classical music. A few months ago, Sasha Annenwald and my brother Matthew and I were having coffee and snacks in the kitchen. And after listening to Matthew and I go on for a while, Sasha said the kindest thing. She said that she could see Michael in each of us. Michael is still here. He lives in us. He lives through us. It is up to us to honor Michael by being our best selves. So in that spirit, let's do what Michael would do and listen. Thank you.
The LA Times is such an important part of Michael's professional career and time here, and so we're thrilled and honored to have Scott Kraft as the current editor-at-large of the LA Times here to share her memories.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Scott Kraft, and I'm very honored to be part of this celebration of Michael's life. I met Michael 3 decades ago when I was the LA Times bureau chief in Nairobi, and he was the bureau chief in Johannesburg, where he had just won a Pulitzer Prize. We met first in regular, very long phone calls on a landline, no bathroom breaks. Some of you who had the pleasure of talking with Michael on a landline know exactly what I'm talking about. Michael could be an intimidating figure in my world of foreign correspondence. He was the smartest person in every room. He and his daughter Danielle wrote each other chatty letters, which I always thought was kind of sweet until he told me they wrote them in Latin. I mean, who does that? We all knew Michael was an intellectual force to be reckoned with. When he moved to Moscow to run our bureau there, I was assigned to replace him in Joburg. Big shoes to fill. My wife Betsy and I inherited the house that Linda and Michael had lived in. I also inherited his phones, which were bugged by the apartheid government. I inherited a number of very well-tended files, Linda's influence, no doubt. And I inherited his large and incredibly bright office staff. I used to say that I spent more time writing paychecks for the office staff than I did writing stories. So he was a bit of an empire builder. But Michael was a joy to follow as a correspondent. First of all, he was one of the best sourced reporters in Johannesburg, and he made a point of introducing me to absolutely everyone. And that generosity is much more unusual than you might think. He was fascinated by the politics of revolution, and the leaders of the anti-apartheid movement loved him. Surprisingly, many leaders of the white minority government found him fascinating too, which, by the way, came in handy when they expelled him, only to rescind their decision a few months later. He had a deep understanding of their country and its history. He knew it better than they did, and they loved listening to him talk. He was also a wonderful mentor to me, but to so many others. He was a champion of women, of female foreign correspondents in particular, several of whom are here, and that was at a time when that was really rare. And unlike so many correspondents, he was a generous colleague who took pride in what we all did. I could see that warmth and pride in his eyes from the time we first met in Johannesburg to the last time we had lunch together a few months before he died. During the weeks that we overlapped in South Africa, we traveled together to Zambia to meet the African National Congress leadership in exile. We would sit in the hotel restaurant waiting and waiting for our appointments to arrive. Don't worry, he said. They needed to be unpredictable to avoid assassination. So we were still waiting, but that first night in Michael's room around midnight, when there was a banging at the door. In came Thabo Mbeki, the future South African president, trailed by the chief military commander and other ANC honchos. They greeted Michael like a brother. It didn't hurt that Michael had remembered to bring Thabo's favorite pipe tobacco, and of course a large bottle of Chivas Regal. They left around dawn. Michael was a writing machine. He wrote late at night, as Chris said, with the classical music on and a glass of red wine or scotch, depending on the country maybe, in his hand. One bit of advice he gave me early on was that I needed to persuade the foreign desk in LA that we didn't need to do so many incremental daily stories from South Africa. He said LA was getting addicted to 3 or 4 stories a week, and he was writing 300 stories a year, it truly was. So one day early in my time in Joburg, I called LA and spoke with one of the desk editors, and I said, so I was thinking, and I said this with a little bit of trepidation, and maybe I should do fewer dailies than Parks. Would that be okay? And there was a long pause. Finally, the editor responded with a chuckle, thank God. Later, as you know, Michael came in from the cold after a stellar career as a foreign correspondent. He moved to LA, a place he'd never lived, he and Lynn had never lived, and soon became managing editor and then editor-in-chief. Michael and foreign editor Simon Lee lured me to an editing job in LA around that time, so I got to witness the arrival of Michael in LA. Some folks in the LA office found him intimidating. I always thought it must have been that Jesuit education. But his closest colleagues knew that he was a truly warm and generous boss and colleague. He had a delightful laugh that always made his face turn red, I remember. I loved making him laugh. He was someone who always had time for you, always had time to talk stories, always loved hearing about your family. When he became editor of the Times, I remember that Time magazine described him as a rumpled foreign correspondent. Boy, they needed a fact checker. Unless their definition of rumpled included cufflinks and a tie. Even back in South Africa, you could spot Michael a mile away in his blue blazer and pressed khaki pants. He would cover township violence, dodging tear gas canisters, rocks, and bullets, and yet be dressed like someone who got lost on his way to church. I once screwed up the courage to ask Michael, why in the world do you wear a sport coat to a protest march? And he had a simple explanation. I want everyone to know why I'm here, he said. I'm not a cop. I'm not a protester. I'm just a reporter. And what a great one he was. Thank you.
If Michael were in charge of the programming, he might say that most of us didn't need to speak, but he would want to hear from his students. And so there's perhaps no greater, more important part of the program today than welcoming. Many of us know her as an associate professor at Cal State University Northridge, but Daniela Gerson was also a student of Michael's. So Daniela.
So when I arrived here today after not having been at Annenberg for many years, and I went into the bathroom, I heard two people talking about how Michael had gotten them a job. I'm wondering how many people here got a job through Michael. If you could just raise your hand, changed your life course in some way, got sucked into some adventure. And when you talk about empire building, I feel like we're all a little bit part of Michael's empire. I arrived in Annenberg 15 years ago this summer, and it wasn't at this building, but not the hall, but the older building over there. And still nervous, excited, trying to make a good impression. During the first class discussion, I cited some new reporting in the Times. Professor Parks, who I think we always called similar, I guess, to Chris, we always called him Michael. And he always signed every email simply equals Parks. I don't know if he did that to you too, or if he actually did Michael. He interrupted me and he said, "You mean that East Coast Times?" It took Sasha to school me who I was dealing with. At the time, I did not know how lucky I was to be part of the first class of the specialized journalism program. I applied late, recently returned to New York from reporting for a year on a fellowship in Europe, and not quite sure what to do next. Roberto Soro, who's somewhere in the back, and we'll hear from later, who I knew from covering immigration, he told me about this new program he was co-launching. 2 months later, it was August, I was here at Annenberg, and I thought it would be a 9-month stint in Los Angeles. Michael would change that. Michael and Roberto were creating a program along with us, and it was thrilling to be part of it, particularly because all around us, the journalism industry was in free fall. I recall 5 outlets that I had contributed to shutting operations in that year. But in Michael and Roberto's classes, we felt like we were pioneers creating something new. The graduates from those first classes are now spread across the globe. And since Michael has died, we've been sharing some of the lessons that we gained over those years, so many years ago. Pekka Pakala, who at least planned to live stream today, even though it's 2 a.m. in Helsinki, just yesterday used Michael's phrase, "follow the money," in his role as a senior communication specialist in the Finnish Prime Minister's office. And we all know that if he's senior communication officer for that prime minister, he's doing a good job. And Natalia Bogolavsky, when she returned to Santiago, Chile, after the program and joined a nonprofit investigative outfit, made sure one question Michael always asked kept guiding her reporting. Who was in the room? The best part of learning from Michael were the sprawling one-on-one conversations where you joined him on a journey of ideas taking you around the globe. And as many have mentioned, these were sprawling conversations. Elizabeth Aguilera, who, if her plane arrived on time, is live streaming from Washington, D.C., where she's moderating a panel, described meetings with Michael perfectly. Michael had a great talent for questions and a gaze that made you realize things as you talked them out. He would just wait for you with his hands folded, and his eyes would get bigger and brighter because he could see your light bulb coming on. And then he would laugh. But the first time I scheduled a meeting with Michael, it didn't start out so well. A few days into school, after I made that not so great first impression, I asked Michael for advice on a story topic I was trying to pull together for Sandy Tolan's class on reporting on LA. Michael mercilessly tore apart my uninformed and hastily formed idea for a story. Anyone else get torn apart by Michael in an editing process? But then he asked me questions about my background. When I said I went to Brown for my BA, he softened. As you saw in, I think, many of the pictures, you probably noticed and also heard about his daughter, Danielle. She had also attended Brown. And Michael told me she had died the previous summer. Over the years, I became familiar with her presence from the photos on his desk and felt Michael's fierce love for her as he shared with me details of her incredible but too brief life. The archaeologist for whom the flags were dropped to half-mast in Cyprus after she died. Upon graduation, I could have ended up just about anywhere, reporting in Brazil, back in New York, perhaps near my parents in DC. Instead, Michael offered me a job to manage the Alhambra Project, a joint initiative between journalism and communication professor Sandra Balro-Keach. The goal was to investigate how local news could cross ethnic and linguistic lines and contribute to stronger local civic engagement. You'll hear some words from Sandra later at the reception, but I need to share, as anyone who saw them together, the two were a formidable pair. And they did not always agree. But they always came to the table together, worked through their differences, and they cultivated this project for 12 years, impacting the community and the scores of researchers, students, and volunteer contributors who were involved in it. For me, being part of the Alhambra Project and later the Alhambra Source changed more than just my geographical trajectory. It transformed how I understood local news, community, and the power of collaboration. My favorite part of working with Michael, as for so many, was taking meetings with him in his office with the classical music playing, the books lined with walls, and the little pieces of paper he would take out when an idea struck him and then slide back in his dress shirt pocket. What happened to all of those little pieces of paper? One day, a student was there when I arrived. She asked me what we were doing creating a site in Alhambra. "It's an adventure," he said, giving me a look. "I think we both like an adventure." I loved being on that adventure with Michael. Michael may be known as a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, an educator, but he also was a media entrepreneur. Our whole wing at Annenberg East, of whom I see quite a few people, Richard, Roger, here today, were projects Michael cultivated. There was Alhambra Source, of course, but there was also Michelle Levander Center for Health Journalism and Boyle Heights Beat and other initiatives that came from that. Richard Kipling and Roger Smith Center for Health Reporting, and each would win multiple awards and create new models and avenues for service journalism. My last conversation with Michael was immediately after my father had received a fatal diagnosis in the fall of 2019. It was Creutzfeldt-Jakob, a neurodegenerative disease. As one does, I searched on Wikipedia, where it said that another former LA Times editor, John Carroll, had died of the disease. I immediately called Michael on my cell phone, knowing he would be there to forge a connection. Though not actually always sure he would answer his cell phone, but luckily this time he did. And his words upon the news were simple: "That's not good." And yet, even though he didn't say that much, I felt so taken care of immediately and comforted by Michael's presence. It was the first time I'd let tears come. My father died and the pandemic came months later, and I regrettably let communication with Michael lapse. The final message I received from him was 2 years later in April of 2021. He wrote after I published a guest essay in that East Coast Times. Dear Daniela, what a nice, so nice piece this morning in the NYT. A moment of reflection on immigration through the reflecting mirrors of your father's life. How are you, your bride, the twins faring? We need to catch up. If you were vaccinated, we probably count as consulting adults in these days. All best equals Parks. I responded to his email, but never heard back from Michael. I wish I'd called and insisted we meet up. The article led to me developing a book project that deals with shifting borders in Soviet history, past and present. I, of course, so wish I could sit with Michael in his office with that classical music playing and have him debunk my ideas and then build them up with more context and insights than I ever could. Michael, you are deeply missed. I'm so grateful for the time you gave to me and all of us.
Well, Daniela, you'll appreciate the Parks family has been generous in so many ways, including boxes of Michael's notes. So I think many of those little pieces are in boxes that we're working on making sure that a journalism archive makes those available to researchers for along the future. The Parks family has been so generous today in including that Michael's sister Lisa is joining us from South Carolina. So Lisa, Parks.
I share love and greetings with all of you. Thank you for being in our lives. Thank you for sharing so many stories already, and I'm looking forward to hearing more stories. So a lot of you, I understand, do not know the dynamics of the Parks family, the Parks siblings, because I was asked several times, as I walked through the hall. So you're going to get the story. So I want you all to imagine when you were young and you would play hopscotch. So there's somebody up here, and then there's somebody here, or there's a box up here, a box here, a box here, a box here, and a box here. And you got to hop, hop, hop. So let's start up at the top. My brother, Michael, is in the top box. Then on the two side boxes where you go boom, boom, are Connie and Molly, the first set of twins. And then you go down into this little skinny horizontal box, and that's me, Lisa. I am the middle of these 7 children, these 7 boxes that you're all hopping through. And then under me are these long horizontal boxes with the second set of twins, Jim and Jane. And then we land on that last little box, my youngest brother, Tom Parks. So I've got 3 siblings left, and when asked to speak here as a representative of the Parks family, I said, oh, sure, I'll do that. And I messaged my brothers and my sister, and I said, would you like to share a story about life with Michael Parks? Well, I didn't get any immediate answers. In fact, I gave them a deadline. And I said, I'm on a time budget here. Okay, you got to give me your notes. I got to get this together. And your time budget's Wednesday of last week. So something trickled in from one brother, Jim, and he just said, well, we didn't really know Michael Parks a lot when we grew up together, but he set a very, very, very high standard of professionalism in academia. That's what he had to share with me. And so then I was like, okay, I've got 2 more siblings. I guess I'm going to be on my own and talk about being, the godchild of Michael Parks. There was only 8 years between us. I was going to talk about, well, my brother Michael taught me how to read newspapers. You only read the paper from the left to the right, and we would have 3 to 4 stacks of papers every Sunday. And then I was going to share the story about, because I was the godchild, Michael was responsible for my religious upbringing. Well, it didn't happen that way. So what Michael felt his responsibility is make sure this child reads. So I remember at the age of 3, I got 3 books. At the age of 4, I got 4 books. And it went on and on. So by the time I was like 16, I'd get these stacks of books, 16 books. So there weren't a lot of presents that went around in the family, but I felt I was the richest of all. the children. So going on to my brothers responding to my messages, one very favorite brother won the lottery. He wrote a story. It is not a short story, but there are some really fun parts. Let's go. This is from my youngest brother, Tom. My first memory of Michael was as my roommate. In a family of 7 kids, he was the oldest, and I'm the youngest. My crib was in his room. He looked after me in my first years. Later, I moved out and shared a room with the younger Parks kids. Michael then had his own room, which is a really big deal in our family. Michael did not waste any time decorating. Stacked floor to ceiling were books. Surprise, surprise, books and more books. Larger books were laid horizontally, supporting the next row of vertical books. All 4 walls were covered, and I always wondered why that room was like so dark. And us little kids always referred to it as the ivory tower. We were not allowed in there. So over time, the room grew smaller as book walls moved inward. Michael had typed an inventory label for each book and taped it on the spine. I can only assume that there was a typed list with the title, author, and location within the bedroom stacks. As far back as I can remember, Michael was typing. On a warm summer night with the windows wide open, I could hear Michael pecking away with his 2 index fingers 3 doors down. I wondered, did he ever learn to type using all of his fingers? In addition to a shortage of bedrooms, hand-me-downs were an integral part of a large family operation. There was a big age gap between Michael and me, and not much made it my way in the annual clothing exchange. However, I was the lucky recipient of a pup tent. The tent was a gift to Michael when he was born. It was from an awning company, an advertiser in our church weekly paper that our dad published. As pup tents go, this was on the larger size and a tad flamboyant. The canvas was maroon and white with stripes. In large white letters across the front was Michael Parks. I used this circus tent camping throughout Michigan. This was the Boy Scout, the Eagle Scout in the family. Often being asked, who is Michael Parks? Or, well, where is he? When will he be performing? Stories of what was going to happen in the future. Michael was not mechanically minded and did not know much about the workings of an automobile, nor did he care. As a young driver, Michael was not aware that when the oil light was illuminated, that the engine needed oil. Without it, the engine would seize up, as it did, I remember it well, 100 miles away from home. The families, and this is up for discussion, was it a 1953 baby blue Ford sedan or a 1954? 54, had died a sudden death in the Irish hills of Michigan. However, it was not all bad. The younger Parks kids benefited from Michael's mishap. The junkyard paid $25, and the funds were used to take us to the Michigan State Fair right down the street. While Michael was in Southeast Asia, Linda needed an automotive upgrade. So my dad, who's known as Pops, orchestrated a car shuffle, finding a newer car for Linda and giving me the hand-me-down, Michael's first car. Remember, we're from Detroit, so cars and, the dates and exactly the style and the color is really important. So this was a 1965 fire engine red Plymouth Valiant with vinyl seats, vinyl floor, and an AM radio. It was a basic car, but it was a workhorse. Michael used it to crisscross the city of Detroit, gathering news from the newsmakers and racing back to the Detroit News with a deadline looming. Engine oil level, never a concern. I drove the car for its remaining life, dutifully pouring a quart of oil into the crankcase every morning until it died. Again, 100 miles away from home. However, it was not all bad. I used the $25 from the junkyard to replace the Michael Parks pup tent that I had forgotten was in the trunk of Michael's first car. These are the kinds of stories that we have about Michael Parks, and we can go on and on and on. Y'all can come up and ask me. I've got some to share later. And again, my heart goes out to all of you. Thank you.
We know that our guests are from all over and have traveled a long ways to be here. Other folks have had a very busy time, and making this a priority has been important. Our next speaker is someone who I think can challenge virtually anyone for the week that they've had. She is the Chief of Staff for the University Communications and the Vice President of Content Strategy for the university. So even from my vantage point, that meant opening a new USC facility in Washington, D.C. And then there was a little event this weekend that USC and the LA Times helped coordinate. So Beth Schuster, thank you so much for being here, for sharing your memories, Michael.
Well, I had a little help in those things, but thank you, Gordon. Good afternoon, everybody. My father, Al Schuster, was Michael's foreign editor at the LA Times. He and my mother, Miriam, regret that they couldn't be here today, but they send their very best regards to you, Linda, to you, Matthew, and to Chris. I'm going to read a few remarks from my dad. He wrote these and rewrote them and edited them and re-edited them. And then last night I said, there will be no more edits. Pretend we are going to press. So that was it. So I need to look at this because I thought I had it memorized, but I don't. I knew Michael from our days in Saigon. I worked at the New York Times, and Michael, the Baltimore Sun. I lived in room 19 at the Continental Hotel, and he lived next door. Let's say the sun never set. His typewriter never stopped. It soon became clear he liked writing at least 1,200 words about everything. So I lost a little sleep. He once told me that as a young lad, he contributed his time to the neighborhood synagogue in Detroit, going there on the Friday night Sabbath to turn on the lights and then to turn them off on Saturday. His 1,200 words, a good Catholic helps a synagogue. China. Miriam and Linda joined us on a journey to a fish farm outside of Beijing. Michael chokes on a bone and is rushed to a local hospital. His 1,200 words, the state of medical care in rural China. Then South Africa. The government wanted to kick him out. He was too good. Editor Bill Thomas and I went there to intervene. That worked. His 1,200 words, officials in South Africa decide to make nice to Michael Parks. So did the Pulitzer Prize Committee, which selected him for his coverage there. And of course, many of those prize-winning stories ran longer than usual. Now, let me conclude with 6 words of my own. Michael was a great foreign correspondent. Those were my father's words. He's 93, and as you can tell, he hasn't lost his touch at all. I just want to tell one quick story of my own about Michael. In 1997, during Michael's tenure as editor of the LA Times, the paper won a Pulitzer for breaking news. Michael said he never attended the ceremony at Columbia for his Pulitzer when he was a reporter. I was too busy working, he said. Again, the sun never set on his work ethic. He is missed by everyone here, and I can tell by everyone who's known him. So thank you very much for having us here today.
Please join us in welcoming Elizabeth Sjogren, who's an associate professor at the Medill School of Journalism and also a former reporter in the LA Times Moscow Bureau.
Long before Michael joined the faculty at USC, he was training young journalists. I'm fortunate to have been one of them. It was early 1990. The Berlin Wall had just come down. and Michael was looking to hire a new reporter into the Moscow bureau. Somehow, he persuaded your father to hire 2 instead of 1. Carrie Goldberg and me, and that was the beginning of my time at the Los Angeles Times. What stands out to me about my time with Michael was his unbridled belief in us. He vacated his office so that Carrie and I could share it. He put in 2 enormous desks so that we wouldn't feel like secretaries or something, but that we were real foreign correspondents. And and he set us free to go out reporting wherever the stories would take us. And they took us across the vast Soviet Union. Then when I came back to the office, Michael, I was just 3 years out of grad school at this time. Michael would sit with me and coax out the best stories possible from my notebooks. And then after not too long, I can't remember how long, there was no sitting next to me and coaxing me. It was just, it's your turn, Elizabeth, you do it. And so it just happened when there was this minor coup in the Soviet Union. He was out of the country. John Thor Dalberg was out of the country. And Carrie Goldberg was, I think, in Siberia. It was just me there. It was quite a day. But that was just a little example of how Michael really believed in me and believed in all of us and just set us free to do the best we could do. Michael was a magnet for young reporters. There was a stream of ambitious 20-somethings coming to our tiny little bureau in Moscow. And he'd send them out to cover the incredible thing that was happening as the Soviet Union was breaking up. And one of those reporters was Esther Schrader, a dear friend of mine who's sitting right back there. He sent her to the Caucasus, to Ukraine, to the Baltic republics. She was everywhere, and she was, I don't know, 17 at the time. But he was sure he could do it. And whenever she was back, he would host her in their home. Linda and Michael would host her when she came back. And it was just a joy to be with him there and to learn from him. And he empowered each of us young people to soar. Michael and I stayed close throughout the years. He paid close attention to my reporting and would give me feedback on stories he liked and those he didn't like very much. And as he came to LA, as Scott was saying, and rose to be the editor of the Times, I was the White House correspondent at that time, and Esther was covering Latin American affairs in the Washington Bureau. Carrie, by that time, had flown off to the New York Times, but he stayed close to all of us. And I always felt like he was cheering for us. After Michael came here to USC, he would love to regale me with stories about his students and their triumphs. And as Carrie said to me yesterday, Michael was a great leader because he led with love. And for me, that love meant, as I said, cheering for me as my career evolved. And about a year and a half ago, some crazy idea came up for me to apply for a job at Northwestern, which was looking for a new head of the graduate journalism program in DC. And Michael encouraged me to do it and then coached me. We spent hours on the phone talking about what it meant to be a professor in this crazy, to teach young people this crazy journalism field that we'd love so much. And I remember one of the things he told me was that the thing that you have to teach journalists is that journalism is changing all the time. So you just need to learn the basics, and you need to be ready for whatever ways it's going to change, because it won't stay the same. And now, Michael didn't get to learn that I did get the job at Northwestern, but I did, and I have the joy of hearing his voice in my head every single day as I teach my students, and delight as I watch them soar. And sorry, I thought I could get through this, but I miss Michael very much. Carrie Goldberg couldn't be here today. She asked me to read this for her. Beatific is my favorite adjective for Michael. I've been grateful to him forever for his extraordinary benevolence and the life-changing effect he had on my career. But I think what I'll always remember most is his essence, not just his goodness, but taking joy in goodness, seeming happy, really, truly happy about being with his family, about working around the clock, about serving and helping readers, colleagues, and students. No matter his age, he always had something of the scrubbed, beaming choir boy about him. He was always in virtuous service. That and an endearing Yoda-like ability to know what to do, along with a willingness to shoulder the burdens of leadership and relish the opportunities it gave him to elevate others. May his memory be a blessing.
And for our final speaker in the formal part of the program, we'd like to welcome Matthew Parks to the podium.
Okay, good evening, everybody. So I'm Michael's last kid. I think I was a bit of a negotiated settlement with Mom, because there was a decade between me and Chris and Danielle. So yeah, I think, no, thanks for having us. So I have a bit of a weird accent. I live in Cape Town, the prodigal son. So, but my wife's son is listening to us. My 4 kids, Danisa and Lenina, our daughters. Fidel and Milka are also watching from Cape Town and from Durban. It's about 1 a.m. their side. And my daughter's a bit upset today. She didn't want to go to class. I said, well, look, there's not a moment to be sad, but rather to celebrate Michael's life, you know? I think to enjoy his memories. And I think he wouldn't be impressed if she didn't go to class. So I think, look, Michael, I think, was unique. I think as his youngest kid, it's always a little bit weird to hear Michael's colleagues talking about him, because you have a slightly different view of your father when you're growing up. I think, like Chris said, my earliest memories of Michael were of him, I think of Al Schuster, working until 2 a.m, typing stories and being a very strict taskmaster. I definitely did not want to earn his wrath as a kid. And I think even as a middle-aged adult, I also didn't want to earn it. I think with hindsight, I'm amazed how patient he was with us, especially with myself. Aunt Lori might remember I was forever misbehaving. I was always in trouble. But look, he had a grueling and an exhilarating job. It wasn't an easy one. Yet he was always supportive of his kids. He was patient and understanding, even when he was less than impressed with us. But his irritation would be momentarily, and then he would move on, you know? I think, you know, well, like many teenagers, I had once had a very bright and brilliant idea as a teenager. Hopefully Mom doesn't remember it. She wasn't impressed either. We were in Jerusalem, and I took Michael's car for a drive across Jerusalem. Because you know, what could possibly go wrong with the unlicensed teenage son of a journalist driving a Palestinian rental car across Jerusalem at the height of the Intifada? You know, what could go wrong? So when I got back, I realized the speedometer had, you know, accumulated some kilometers. So if you remember that movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, so I tried it. Surprisingly, it didn't work out. So I tried to just disable it. That didn't help. But I was very brilliant. I nicked one of the indicators in the car. So I got the driver to fix it. I didn't know Mike had also nicked the other indicator. And when he came back, he was like, so why is the indicator now fixed? So that's how he caught my little brilliant idea. But look, once Michael had his say, and it wasn't a pleasant conversation, it was done, and he expected you to learn your lesson quickly. I think Michael was really a creature of habit, so when I smell Old Spice, the aftershave, it's Michael, so I buy it myself. You know, we grew up as kids listening to BBC and to Voice of America News. You could hear the bell before the news. I can remember myself and my mother, Michael, sitting in Beijing in 1983, listening to the news about the Korean airline, which was shot down by the Soviet Air Force, or the war between Argentina and Britain over the Falkland Islands. It's a bit strange as, you know, 8-year-old kid to know all these things. But I think we're really fortunate all the places we lived in, from Beijing to Joburg, to all the events we witnessed from the collapse of the Soviet Union, to the Oslo Peace Accord in Jerusalem. had luck to visit Germany last year. I met with senior politicians and all that. But I think for me, the real highlight is the place that Michael took Mom and myself to visit in East Berlin just before the wall fell in '89. So hunted and hunted and hunted. And I found it after 7 kilometers of walking. I think Michael lived journalism. He'd always convert a garage or a flat into his office. As Lisa said, it would have wall-to-wall bookcases, stacks of newspapers. I would earn my little pocket money by helping him to cut his telexes. I don't know if students here know what a telex machine was, the precursor to the fax machine. His colleagues, all the journalists you would hear about, Al Schust and many others, would be honorary members of our family, always invited to dinner when they'd be in town, from wherever they're coming from. I think for the past year, it's not easy, but it was quite heartwarming to hear from Michael's colleagues, Liz, Carrie, Emily, the Moscow alumni, how he sought to be a mentor for them and how well they'd done in his life. I think he would really be pleased and be proud. He would often come to Cape Town with various young USC students, barely 20 years old, to expose them to the international world of journalism. When Chris and I met with Scott, who followed Michael in Joburg, so I don't know if Scott was going to say this, but he had mentioned to us earlier this year that Michael was a student of revolution and liberation movements, and he was passionate about it. He loved reading. He used to get in trouble with the police in South Africa. I remember after Mom wasn't there. Yeah, I don't know where you were, but you were on holiday, I think Windsor. Chris had gone, Dingo had gone. It was me and Michael, and the police broke into the garage. Then they broke into Mom's car, but there was no radio in the car, so they're trying to cover up. They actually wanted to break into his office, and the car was just a decoy. At one stage, it became a little bit rough, but worrying. So he had an armed guard protecting our house with a shotgun just before Scott came down, which I thought was great and fun. And police used to visit Michael and looking for somebody, and Michael was like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. But that person was actually sitting in Danielle's room before they go and hide in the US Council the next day because on the run from the police. When Michael left, he had a farewell party. Also, the political activists came and so forth to wish him well. When I was at school in Joburg, my headmaster wasn't impressed with Michael. He was a former Rhodesian security police officer. He was like, so you're the bloody son of the communist, So yeah. But anyway, Michael loved reading. I think he was very fond of his days at the Jesuit high school. I think he loved the Jesuit values. He'd always kind of listen to what the Pope had to say over Christmas. I think he really loved the Jesuit values of life learning. And I think wherever he worked, Michael always spent hours studying the local language, whether it's Chinese, or Russian, or Hebrew, Arabic, often becoming fluent. Over dinner, especially Chinese dinner, he'd always have some little quip in Russian or Chinese. He had one in Afrikaans about die boer maak 'n plan, which means the farmer or the Afrikaner makes a plan. I think that was Michael's kind of creed. I've also kind of embraced, times are tough, but you'll make a plan. He enjoyed bantering in Latin with our late sister Danielle, another classic scholar. I think Michael and Danielle really had a special connection. They were really similar in many respects. He was very proud of her achievements, and she was proud of his, and I think very protective of him as well. I think Michael was a formidable journalist, as you've heard from people who know better than me. But I think, the second chapter in his career as a professor really helped him shape many young students, share the lessons and experience he had learned from over half a century of reporting across the world. I think he'd always say to me, I'm sure he said to the students, so you've seen history changing international events, so now explain it in a way that makes sense to the ordinary reader in Orange County or LA, who has no idea where's Georgia or Armenia or Azerbaijan. He was a journalist, he was a professor, but he was also a father who made sure his kids and his 4 grandchildren had all the opportunities they needed to succeed in life. I was amazed how he would enjoy spending time discussing the latest English Premier League soccer games with my son, Emilka, who is a soccer fanatic. I just know about Chelsea. Mike could have the latest games, who scored what, who didn't score why. Or letting a little Lenina, you might have seen the pictures, bearing him with under her teddy bears, getting updates on our son Fidel's school reports or Danisa's career in marketing. He was an easygoing traveler. When we had our wedding in the northern part of South Africa about 20 years ago, Temperatures there, I don't really know Fahrenheit, but I Googled it. It would hit easily 104 degrees Fahrenheit in Limpopo, the northern part of South Africa. Michael would be cool, wearing his suit, his blazer, his tie. Years later, he would tell us how he fondly befriended the hotel owner quickly, where our wedding took place, and organized a bar tab. Just keep the whiskey coming. Limpopo is hot. I think despite his stern image to us as kids, he was really a softie at heart. In the later years, he enjoyed spending time doting on his little puppies. I think Michael was at his happiest watching the sunset from his flat in Camps Bay. You might have seen the photo. Or sitting in his backyard, he's got a little backyard forest in Pasadena with a glass of wine, sharing war stories. I think my biggest regret is that he didn't really have more years to enjoy his well-earned retirement. So I think we'd really be grateful that the USC community gave him a wonderful sequel and illustrious career. And who knew Michael would have become such a fan of the USC Trojans? Or tell us about this little statue of a puppy or dog. But he would tell us. And bring back little USC paraphernalia for his grandchildren, who will still go to campus in South Africa wearing it. So I think, Michael was a larger-than-life Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. I think he was nominated once additionally as well, if I'm right. I don't think any of this would have been possible without his wife, our mother, Linda. And it really was a unique partnership. And together they really made it happen. I think without a mother, Michael wouldn't have been able to do it. Michael made a name for himself across the world of journalism, but he never forgot his parents or his brothers and sisters. I think you can see Lisa and Laurie, Madeline and Tim. He always retained the Parks family sense of Irish humor. And no matter where we lived in the world, he always made sure that to ship us off to Detroit, to Oscoda, where we spent time with family. I think this was important, as well, because Connie, his sister, would always share and spill beans with me about Michael's younger days. And I'm told once he set a toilet seat on fire at the house. So I don't know if that's true or that's Connie's embellishment, but as far as I'm concerned, it's true. I think family was important to him, and we could see a lot of our grandfather Pops in Michael. I don't think it's a coincidence that Pops, who spent his retirement in Oscoda, and I always thought Oscoda is like a big, famous place in the US, and I didn't realize most people haven't heard of it. It was a nice little rural part of northern Michigan. So Pops was such a pillar of that community that in his retirement at the library at the US Air Force Base was named in his honor. So I think you can see a tradition of books and so forth. So I think the loss of a loved one was never easy. It took me some time to realize I can't photo him on a Sunday evening to discuss what is Trump up to today. And I would love kind of provoking him about it. But I think we'll be forever grateful that he had such an adventurous life at the LA Times. I think that he found a second home at USC, and most importantly, that he left this life on his terms. At home with my mother and our brother. I think one couldn't ask for a better ending. That's how Michael would have wanted it. And I think that also would have meant a lot for our sister Danielle. So I think maybe let's say, well, I've definitely exceeded Sasha's 4 minutes. But what can you do? So I think just to say thanks to the USC and the LA Times families for putting everything together today. To Sasha, to Nancy, Scott, Gordon, Ellen, many, many others. Too many. I think Mike would have been happy to see everyone together. And I think you probably would have signed off with an amused or bemused cheers. So thanks very much.
When this program was designed, the question was how to begin to celebrate and recognize a remarkable person. And I want to thank everyone from the Parks family to all of the speakers, to everyone here for embracing the idea of celebrating Michael. But we realize that if your experience has been like mine, this last few minutes has your mind thinking of all those moments when he sternly but accurately corrected you, not because he was doing it to make a point, because it was important that it was right. those moments where he was generous and kind, and those moments that you heard about his laughter and his smile. So we thought, what better way to embrace that and to allow that to continue? So we'll move outside, and the way that we've thought about it is the open microphone, the reception, and the time to be outside is a little bit of thinking. If you have this wistful moment, that maybe I will look over in the corner and envision Michael sitting there and enjoying the moment. Thank all of you for being here and looking forward to the next episode.
I'm Serena Cha, and I was lucky to work for Michael Parks several times during my 18 years at USC. I received unconditional support from him, as did the student media outlets I supervised. I'd like to share some of Michael's favorite sayings. Number one, manage by walking. That's what he did as soon as he got to USC. And at ATVN, Annenberg's first student media operation, we were excited that he made it to the bowels of the building to see the students in action. He couldn't stop smiling when he saw them reporting, writing, editing, and producing live newscasts. For Michael, ATVN embodied what he loved, a working newsroom, and what he would make his priority, the students. Number two, good broadcast producers can handle anything. This was amazing to me, because sometimes broadcast journalists are looked down on. But he was a print legend who viewed TV news as the toughest battleground. For years, broadcast journalists have fought for quality while dealing with changing technology and deadlines that come in minutes. He knew this would become the norm for all journalism, PR, and communication students entering our sped-up world. For this reason, he supported the expansion of student media at Annenberg. That included the push for radio and podcasting, which Willis Seidenberg, who couldn't be here today, says none of that would have happened without Michael. Number three, one of my favorites. We need a heavy lifter. Michael would disarm you with his directness. And just as you were about to say, uh-oh, he'd pounce and ask you to serve on another contentious committee, draft more curricula, or solve some nagging headache. As both faculty and staff knew, even if you were revving at 300%, Michael would speak to your work ethic and passion, and you would always say yes, over and over again, because it was him, because he's the one who asked. Michael helped persuade me to become the founding executive director of the Annenberg Media Center at the front of this building. In the lead up to the launch, he recruited many faculty, including not just journalists, but PR, and tried to bring together disparate but overlapping media efforts throughout the Annenberg School. So that included documentary, sports, arts, investigative journalism, web production, social media, political analysis, you name it.
I'm Sandra Ball-Rokich. Michael's loves his family, being a foreign correspondent, local news, and his library. The best of the Irish Catholic mindset, Jesuit, almost Talmudic, with that Irish glint in his eyes and a Scotch in hand. His understanding of the importance of local news for democracy came well before Alhambra Source, with his attempt to publish local sections when he was editor of the LA Times. I don't think that many journalists would have approached me, the sociologist researcher, with the proposal to join his local news initiative with the Metamorphosis Project to establish the Alhambra Source Project. I only wish he were still here to know that our 12-year collaboration has had lasting effects on the political infrastructure of Alhambra. He would know that we succeeded in being a catalytic agent of change in the direction of grassroots organizing, a more diverse and representative set of decision makers, and increased civic engagement. I miss you, Michael. You, my loyal and supportive friend. Thank you.
I'm Dodie Fromson. Murray Fromson was my husband. And if he were here, he would tell you that he met Michael in Vietnam. I might have met him then, too, because I would go back and forth from Bangkok sometimes. But I certainly knew Michael and Linda and the family in Moscow because we lived in the same compound. And my late daughter was their babysitter. So we were firmly entrenched, all of us who lived in Moscow. And if we lived in the same compound, we were really there. I think one thing that Murray might remember and talked about is Moscow was a very tough place for a television correspondent. And those who were writing, like Rick Smith, like Michael Parks, had a much easier time. It wasn't easy, but they had paper and pen, and they could write what they saw. Murray had to do it somehow with a camera person, and usually the one he was assigned was blind, and the sound man was always deaf. So he didn't have a very good chance of getting a story out. But then he would say, "Where is Michael anyway?" They all went out, whatever story they felt like following of the day. But sometimes there would be a story, and most of the people would go to that story. But never Michael. Michael would be gone. He'd be in Siberia or who knows where for days on end, and he'd come back with something incredible, but he was gone. So that was Michael. He really did probably write 25 hours a day. Anyway, lovely to be here, and I've said hello to my former friend and roommate practically in Moscow, Linda, and the rest is for all of you.
I'm Carol Williams, who Michael Parks renamed without my permission CJ when we knew each other in Moscow in the Soviet era during the mid to late 1980s. I got a call from Michael when I was the West German correspondent in Bonn for the Associated Press on Christmas Day 1989, and he said, "CJ, the LA Times is going to hire an Eastern European correspondent, and you're the one they're going to hire. Because I want you to send your 10 best clips, not 9, not 11, and don't forget to include the Matthias Rus story and the earthquake in Armenia." He goes, "Send it to Alvin Schuster, no C in Schuster," he goes, "and you're going to get the job. Click." And it was true. He kind of railroaded me through a lot of other competition, and I embarked on a 25-year career as a foreign correspondent with the Los Angeles Times, and I know I've always had Michael to be grateful for that. That's all I wanted to say.
I've been remembering the first time I had a long personal conversation with Parks. It was during the time sort of figuring out whether I was going to work here or not, and I'd gone in to see Jeff Cowan, and he roped me into some event ballroom thing at the Beverly Wilshire. And Parks and I were sitting at the same table. And when it was over, there's a huge line at the valet parking. So he said, let's go to the bar and have some scotch. And we knew we had never been stationed in the same place at the same time, but started trying to figure out whether we had ever parachuted into the same shoot 'em up or earthquake or coup or something when we were both out wandering around, which led to a good deal of storytelling. And it turned out we couldn't figure out whether we ever had some near misses, but we knew a lot of people in common. In fact, we had some very close friends, other nomads who we'd intersected with at different times and places. Many of them, sadly, already passed, which then led to a series of toasts. Save me a stool at the bar, Skanky. Save me a stool at the bar, Blundy. Save me a stool at the bar, Montalbano. And this kind of went on, and so we had to get another glass of scotch. And we just sort of, he got into that old sort of nostalgic moment about when newspapers were fat and travel money was unlimited and the news hole was infinite. And right about the time this started getting maudlin, he said, sort of looked at his glass and said, I don't tell war stories. And I said, well, what do you tell these kids anymore? And he said, no, I'm watching them invent the future. I said, you ought to come, see it. Save me a stool at the bar. Parks, see you soon. Bye.
Oh, in a galaxy long ago and far away, there was a room. And this room was unlike any other room in the entire universe. Unlike those other rooms, which were full of chaotic, crazy, conflict-driven faculty or people, this room was quiet and soft and gentle and welcoming. When I came here, hired by Michael, I had never taught before, and I would go into that room where the classical music was playing, where there was always candy on the low glass table, where there were already books and magazines there that I wanted to read, and Michael would talk to me. We'd talk about our colleagues at the Baltimore Sun, we'd talk about foreign correspondents that we knew in common, and we talk about theology. We talk about theology because Michael made sure that Annenberg would have a chair in media and religion, which is how I got here and why Michael hired me. Michael, I think, was glad to have someone to talk to theology with him because not many other members of the faculty wanted to get that deep into Catholicism. So, my memories of Michael are very much tinged by the love, the compassion, and the kindnesses he showed me consistently. And I am happy to say that the specialized journalism program, which Roberto helped launch, was a product of Michael's bringing this chair to USC. And that's because Michael had a vision for technological advancement, but he did not let content suffer. Michael was a smart man, and he wanted smart journalists, and he believed that both went hand in hand together. You cannot advance the technology without having reporters who can go in depth and tell their stories. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ernest Smith, and I used to direct the Cape Town program, which was very dear to Michael's heart. As a matter of fact, the very first time I taught it, there was only 3 students. I thought they were going to cancel, and he said, absolutely, no way, and we kept doing it. Now, the first time I actually heard of Michael was way before I met him. I was working at the Wall Street Journal on the foreign desk, copy desk, and he was reporting about South Africa. And I actually thought he was black. And the reason I did was, it was a number of reasons why I would think that, not just, whatever. Because at that particular time in the struggle, it had gone from basically a sort of, it was a negotiating thing where you could, tit for tat between the ANC and the apartheid government, where the exiles of the country, 92% of the people in South Africa who were oppressed, hit the streets, and their goal was to make the country ungovernable. So you could not cover that story without being out there with the people. So I just wanted to, one story that I didn't remember until I found it online, and this is the one I remember so clearly, and Michael wrote, it's called Sipo Calls Himself a Human Radio. Each morning he gets on the train near his home deep in Soweto, outside Johannesburg, and begins to repeat the news from the Radio Freedom broadcast of the African National Congress. As the crowded train rattles on toward downtown Joburg, Sipo, a brokerage clerk in his mid-30s, gives a detailed rundown of the growing unrest around the country, recounts the latest exploits of our fighters in the Spear of the Nation, the Congress's military wing, and reports on the activities of the group's exile leadership. Then he starts a discussion based on Radio Freedom's latest commentary. And the quote is, "Man, do I have an audience today. 2 years ago, people weren't interested, not at all. And I might have been talking to myself most mornings. Today, they want me to shout out the news. And they leave the train not just talking about the ANC, but ready to work for it, to fight for it." One of the things that distinguishes reporting is that it was a lot like this. Ordinary people, not victims, actors in their own destiny, empowered people. People who had normal lives, who got on trains, who went to work, but fought every day for their freedom. And years later, Michael's over there, was 87, I think, 86. I went back in 2008, and I remember I was in a nightclub called the Galaxy in Athlone, near where Matthew lives. And it was, well, it's a long story. But anyway, I ended up in this top story place where there was the jazz was playing, and there was some people just started talking to you in South Africa. And there were some older people, and I mentioned some about LA, and I mentioned Michael Parks, and they said to me, oh, I think my uncle hid him out in our frozen, they had a butchery in the Athlon, and I think Michael was out, and they pulled him in there. And they said to me the greatest compliment. He said he was one of the good ones. This is what I remember about Michael. Thank you very much for this occasion to have this chance to share with him.
I'm Judy Miller, and Professor Emerita here at USC, which means I left and got a free parking space. And I'm thrilled to be here today to be part of this. I wish Michael could be here to hear this outpouring of love and friendship and respect. And I wish he were here because I would have the chance to thank him, which I don't think I ever really did. I want to thank him. I want to thank you, Michael, for planting that seed in my brain when I first met you at the home of Murray Fromson and Dodie Fromson, and you approached me, and Murray had already been trying to plant the seed, and you came to me and you said, if you ever want to leave, transition. No, he didn't say if, he said when. When you want to transition from the daily grind of network news and give your experience to the next generation of broadcast journalists, I hope you think of Annenberg and I hope you call me. And I wasn't ready that day, but he did say when. And sometime later I would be ready. And when I was ready to leave that daily grind of network news, even though I worked part-time for them while I taught here, I called Michael Parks because he had given me his card and I kept it. And I called him on the phone right from our newsroom, and I said, you still interested in hiring a broadcast journalist for the... He says, oh, your timing is interesting. We are just looking at somebody for a full-time job. That was Pat Dean. And he said, but we could probably make room for another one. And he did. And he helped me work out a part-time contract with ABC so that I'd be full-time here. And I want to thank you, Michael, for understanding that when I thought, mistakenly, that leaving the convoluted politics of network news and going to the hallowed halls of academia, that things would be clear and smooth and easy. And I didn't understand anything, much more arcane, right? All these things you had to navigate. And again, just as others have said, your office door was always open. Thank you for that. Thank you for the bowl of candy, which I think was Pat Dean's, Everett, and the music. Everybody mentions the music, but you can't imagine when you're stressed, you don't understand what's happening. Why is this happening to me? Does it happen to everyone here? And you hear the music, and you're welcomed in at any time. And he was able to kind of, yeah, well, that happens. Don't worry about that. And it was really wonderful. So thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sandy Tolan. I took over and walked into these giant shoes that used to belong to Michael Parks when he was the director of the specialized, and founder, of course, of the specialized journalism program. But I want to say something that just picked up on what Judy just said, which is his open door. I mean, we've heard a lot about how he directed the journalism school 3 times in addition to specialized journalism. But what was remarkable to me is we've all heard these accolades at how much he accomplished in so many different ways here at USC and obviously at the LA Times with his family. The fact that he always made time. I mean, he literally, you could walk into his office. And, you know, as Gordon could attest to more than anyone, it's a hard job. You have so many things to do. And Michael was just like, oh, hello. Sit down. And of course, KUSC was playing, and you sit and you talk to him, and you always, I mean, I just thought about this as we were having these wonderful tributes. I never appreciated how much he listened, and how actually in retrospect, I looked so forward to sitting with him because I knew I would get his full attention and his wise response. I mean, wise is a word that's probably overused, but not with Michael. The only other thing I wanted to say is, in addition to his generosity and his welcoming and his listening, you know, he told me once, well, you know, whenever I would leave a bureau, you know, he was saying, you know, when I walk away from a job, then I forget everything about the job and I don't have anything to do with it again. And I'm like, I wonder if this really goes. No, when I left, you know, this bureau or that bureau, Beijing or Johannesburg, I would lock the door, slide the keys through the mail slot, turn around, and forget everything about what I ever did. Well, you know, when he was I think he was just saying that because when I took over, when I was being mentored by him, when he was getting ready to hand me the baton for specialized journalism, I couldn't have had a more patient guide. I couldn't have had, and the more you're around Michael, the more you realize he knew so much, not just about the world, not just about all the many places he's been, but also about USC that I could never begin to scratch the surface. He knew so many people, and all you had to do is ask. And his generosity, I mean, I've missed him, and as so many people have, and there's so many times in the last months that I've wanted to call him up and say, Michael, what about this? What about that? So I'm one of many who was hired by Michael and who cared about Michael and felt cared for by Michael. And like all of you, I miss him.
My name is Tom Goodnight, and I'm from the other side of the tracks. I teach in the communication program, but don't be afraid because I've always been a friend of journalists. In graduate school, I was by the William Allen White School at Northwestern, by the Medill School, and I've had the great good fortune to be here at the Annenberg School. And for that, I'd like to thank Dean Cowan for hiring me. Otherwise, I've been spending my last 20 years in Schaumburg. I knew Michael from a unique perspective, academic chit-chat, and solving the great problems of the world. This could only be done over a drink at the Biltmore Hotel. So from time to time, we just go to the Biltmore, and if you'd like to hear about those conversations, well, we can continue. The thing I remember most about Mike is kind of irritating. I remember we talked about teaching a course together, and the next thing I knew, before he could teach, he'd retired. I took that personally. But he would, I remember someone made the notion that there were Yoda-like sayings. Well, for me, it wasn't just a number of words, it was 3 words: responsibility to protect. And we were going to teach a course on responsibility to protect. I'm going to teach that course, but after listening to his family and listening to you guys here, it'll include another element. When Michael was covering apartheid in South Africa, my work-study student at Northwestern was leading the divestment movement on campus. I, of course, chimed in. It's the only political movement I've chimed in my life, and I'm proud of it. But I met with the president, who brought a labor negotiator, and the president's first question to me, leading the faculty to divest, was, how much should we cut your salary? Things were a little rough at Northwestern. It's Chicago, after all. But Park had a way with words where if you listened just to a word or to a phrase, there was something there, something that resounded. I will remember him as I create this course in deliberation and to responsibility to protect heritage, but also international parks. I will add truth and reconciliation, because truth and reconciliation is something we all need to write and talk about these days. So thank you for the opportunity to address and my love to Professor Parks.
So I have a message from Mickey that I'd like to play. She sent it to me, and I hope that you can hear it. Make sure I have my volume up.
Hi, everyone. It breaks my heart that I can't be there with all of you to celebrate Michael's life today. I think he would approve of what I'm doing, though, particularly since it has to do with Africa. But I was so in awe of him, and he was so wonderfully supportive of me during my early days at Annenberg, except for that one moment. I went into his office to discuss getting a specialized journalism degree, to pursue the master's degree. And he looked at me like, and what's going to be your topic? And I told him I would like to look at the evolution of women in Saudi Arabia, because I had just come back from there and things were changing a bit, particularly since it was just before they were given the right to drive. He looked back at me and said, I've seen that story before. I looked back at him and not like I'm going to do it. And that was the start of a very beautiful friendship and working collaboration, and I will miss him all the days of my life. He was something really, really special. Take care, everyone.
So Sasha asked me to tell this story because I'm one of the students on the MSJ program. I'm a pediatrician, and I work at Harbor UCLA, which is a safety net hospital. Nobody has anything. And I was really frustrated that, well, at the moment, John Boehner was trying to cut SNAP, which is the food program for kids. And I was like, I'm from Ohio. No self-respecting Ohioan would stop feeding children. I was like, if they saw faces that I see, they're not just statistics. And so I thought maybe if I could write about the stories and the kids that I was seeing for the public, somebody might care. But I don't know how to write for the public. I know how to be a science geek. And so I was looking for somewhere where I could learn how to write for the public. And I went on the internet and found Annenberg's number. And as many of you have heard this story before, when I called, Professor Parks answered the phone. I have no idea why he answered the phone. And so I was telling him my story, and then I was, just kept talking. He goes, and I just kept talking and talking, which I do. And I was like, well, would you even consider somebody like me? And he's like, what I'm trying to tell you is yes, you can stop talking. It's like, and how lucky for me to have the opportunity to have my path be influenced by Parks. And I'll stop there because I'll cry. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Esther Schrader, and as you've heard, I was working as a young reporter in Moscow when I got to know Michael. I have one story. When I got to Moscow as a young reporter, I came with a massive, massive suitcase. I mean, like massive, bigger than me. Because I thought, well, I'm gonna be here for a couple of years. I mean, I gotta pack everything. And I was staying at his home. He was kind enough to welcome me to his home, and he brought me into his bedroom. He was packing to go to a diplomatic conference, and he showed me his suitcase, and he said, "I'm gonna teach you how to pack." And he said, you need this, you need that, you need this, you need that. You don't need any of the rest of it. He said, that's my first thing that I'm going to teach you about being a foreign correspondent, pack light. So when I came today flying out from DC for 36 hours, this is what I packed. Thank you, Michael.
So, hi, my name is Nancy Ruiz, and I was Michael's assistant. Well, he was director for 3 terms here. And in what I hear from all of you is what I witnessed while I was working with him. Just the human being that he was, and how he really took everyone, everyone's story, everyone's concern to heart. And I was lucky to witness all of that. So I do miss Michael. I'm sorry he's gone. But, he's in a better place.
And that's what he would want us to not be sad. He would want us to be happy where he is. So I have lots of stories, but I'll just leave it there.
I don't know if Joe Piasecki is still here, but I think students were so important to Michael. And so I wanted Joe to also speak, just because I do. I know, come here. And I'm going to let you wrap it up. So that's a big burden, but people can go after this. But one thing is that Michael said to me that he's never seen the faculty so happy as they are with Gordon as the director. And that, you have said many thanks today, deep thanks to you for being there, for leading us, for taking us to everything that actually Michael, as Jeff so beautifully laid out, this incredible vision that Michael had, this capacity to look around the corner and see what's coming next. There were no digital teachers here when he came in 2000. None. And they didn't exist even in 2008. We didn't have digital instruction. And Michael was a very, very big part of making sure that we had online education and that students, and his vision for specialized journalism was also very radical. He wanted it to be for mid-career journalists, because at that time we had jobs. And he recognized that at about the age of 35, 40, you started to get pegged for what you did well. In my case, if I'm a dance critic, everybody wants me to write about dance. But what if I want to do other things? I have other interests. Don't keep making me write about dance. I want to do other things. And so just like Chris just spoke about, he took people who were established and said, come, be part of an academic university where you can read everything you want to read. You can study to your heart's content. Brilliantly, you can take courses across this university and cherry pick at the age of 35, 40. Now, he shrunk the program down to 1 year because he also recognized that people couldn't afford to do this for 2 years. And number two, journalists belong in the field. They belong out. So cram them full of information. All of it was, multimedia information, and get them out there and get them jobs and get them thinking and get them working with this profound, I think, always a sense of social justice, of giving voice to people who do not have voice. And his roots were just really, really strong. Jeff, thank you for hiring him. That was like such a gift to so many of us. Daniela, you said it. I mean, he grew many of us. Chris Parks also said that we were, like his family, we were grown by him. And I grabbed Joe only because I didn't want to be here by myself alone.
And so that I didn't run away.
Yeah, and here's another student and anybody else who just wants to get it off their chest, whatever. Great. I'm looking at Ariana Sikorsky. I mean, these people who've come, Sophie Lafferty is here, people who have come from all different parts of his life. It's just so great, and I miss this school tremendously. Alan, thank you for your photographs. Get me right. All right, this is Joe Piasecki, a treasure.
Thank you, Sasha. So I was a little surprised to be brought up here. I feel like I'm immensely underqualified to even think about wrapping this up. I would love to toss it to someone else. But I have to say, I'm here because Michael Parks saw something in me, and he brought me into the specialized journalism program, and he assembled a lot of talent in that room. It's just a continuing, we've all gone in a lot of different directions, but a lot of us have stayed in touch, and it's really kind of enriched what we do. Like you said, with kind of thinking outside the box and letting people find their own direction. Michael very gently pushed me in a more entrepreneurial direction, which is where I find myself today. So even though it feels like I'm doing something very different than what I was doing when I first met Michael, perhaps that was part of his design. And we both had in common, I went to a Jesuit high school in Cleveland, which, as I later found out after the program, was part of the Detroit province, which was also where Michael was studying to become a Jesuit. And then just at one of these events, years later, he let it drop that, oh yeah, Joe and I, we go way back in the Jesuit. And I didn't think that I knew anybody that he would have known back in Detroit before he decided to jump into journalism and start translating press releases in Latin at the Vatican. But sure enough, my teachers, they knew him, and I just feel this very deep connection that goes beyond journalism, but I would say almost like humanitarianism, like his vision for a better world and for happier people and for people fulfilling their not only their goals, but kind of their purposes, even when they don't really know what those are. So yay for Michael for bringing us all together, right? Cheers. Oh yeah, and the stories, just the stories he would drop during class. He'd be giving us these lessons of very important things, but just drop a little thing. Oh yes, when I was in South Africa and there were men with guns, I would just hide over here in the church. But meanwhile, back to the textbook. And I was just, if only for more stories. We're just always thirsty for more. Thanks, everybody.
Hi, I'm Nick Cull. I'm one of Michael's colleagues from Annenberg. And like so many of you, I can speak about him as being a wonderful colleague, a mentor, and a friend. And each of those roles would kind of blend one into the other. He was so generous with his time. I was sometimes shy of going to visit him in his open office, but it was either Nancy or Pat who said, no, please, you should go over and see Michael because you always make him laugh. And so memories of Michael laughing was an important part of what I've heard today. But I'm often visiting around the world, and Michael is one of those threads that bind together so many communities. And when he passed away, I had to call people I knew at Reuters Institute at University of Oxford, who they feel a tremendous gratitude to Michael for what he did to support them as being part of their board for many years. I spoke about him with people who remembered him in South Africa. Frini Jinwala spoke of him as being just one of the best. And it was lovely to hear how much he'd meant to people he was supposed to be reporting on. And the same with people who were part of that press corps in Russia also speak so warmly of him. He was always kind and would do favors for people. And when I was starting out the Masters in Public Diplomacy degree, we wanted our students to have contact, to understand how to run a press conference. And so we designed an exercise where they would be fed a little bit of information at a time, but then would be put under pressure by a journalist asking questions. And Michael agreed to be that journalist. But we had to ask him not to be the wonderful Michael Parks as a sort of a statesman of journalism, but to recover who he was in the late 60s, early 70s, when he was a hungry young foreign correspondent, and to dust down Saigon Parks. And he said, "You really want me to do that?" And I said, "Oh, please." And as a special favor, he was super tough on the students, quite against his nature. And it was a wonderful thing to see. He did that, I think, for 3 years in a row. He came in to do the live press conference exercise for the students. And it was just a wonderful thing that he was prepared to voluntarily come in and put the students through their paces. There's so much more to say. I'm just so grateful that we can be together and remember him And I just wish he were here too, because he is a great loss in all of our lives. But what a wonderful person for us to have known and to have been shaped by. So thank you very much.